Hello everyone and welcome to the channel where we talk about strategy, profits, growth and pretty much everything the modern business is concerned about. I decided to create a short series concerning public-private partnership and how this model can be beneficial for both the public and private sector. So in today's episode, we will see what exactly is public-private partnership, the economic characteristics of PPP projects, the levels of private sector engagement in PPP contracts, and the life cycle of PPP. This series intends to provide information and insights on the public-private partnership, which has generated a lot of interest from governments around the world for leveraging private sector involvement in developing and sustaining public infrastructure and services. The focus is to identify the best methods and practices on how this project can yield results for both the public and private sector, promote innovation, while supporting economic growth, etc. Initially, public-private partnerships were favored by transport, energy, and other type of large infrastructure intense sectors. More recently, the concept has been expanded to include social sectors such as education, for example. Considering the wide scope of activities covered under PPP, it is understandable that there is no universal accepted kind of definition of them. However, it is possible to identify a set of core principles that are common across international definitions. Public-private partnership is essentially a funding model which represents the costs of a new public infrastructure project. The umbrella of public infrastructure projects can include a new airport, a power plant, telecommunication system, and other projects like that, with a public partner represented by the government at the state or national level, and the private partner represented by a private-owned business like a private entity. PPP is a broad term encapsulating this basic idea of its very core value. It can be defined in the following manner. A long-term contract between a private party and a government entity for providing a public asset or service in which the private party bears the significant risk and management responsibility and remuneration in link to performance. PPP covers anything ranging from a simple short-term management contract to a really long-term contract that includes funding, planning, building, maintenance, and anything around it. The kind of typical public-private partnership infrastructure project necessitates a large initial investment that is locked in, following which the operation and maintenance costs are paid as the project progresses. In comparison to the total cost, the maintenance and operation costs are a small fraction that hugely impacts several other characteristics of PPP financing. To truly understand the choice of financial arrangement of a PPP project, three economic characteristics must be explored. First, the kind of dynamic characteristic of a PPP project is large enough to require independent management, particularly during the construction and operational phases. When two or more projects are running in parallel, it is important that the synergies of the operating projects must be understood. Secondly, the production all the production processes during construction and operation are in most cases subcontracted, which means that any scale and scope economies are essentially internalized by specialized service providers such as construction companies, toll collectors, maintenance construction, and so on. Lastly, efficiency is at its peak when construction and operations are bundled together. Bundling forces investors to internalize the maintenance and operation cost, to generate incentives and design the project in such a way so that the life cycle costs are minimized. So let's see some figures. In this figure, you see the level of private sector engagement in public-private contracts. PPP arrangements are at their prime when incorporated in large projects that require highly skilled personnel and a considerable amount of funds to begin with. In countries that specify that the state legally owns the public-private infrastructure, public-private partnership is of a great use. The widespread growth of PPP has ties with the development of project finance, which is essentially a technique based on lending against the cash flow of a project, which is both economically and legally self-contained. This is ensured with the creation of a special purpose vehicle which its sole objective is to build and operate the project. A sponsor set up an SPV before the bid for the project actually begins. The sponsor responsibility is to bid, develop and manage the project and act as the equity investor. Before committing the resources, a lender examines the characteristics of the sponsor. Sponsors, in turn, are operational, which means to say that they belong to the industry, securing themselves as subcontractors or financial sponsors. They supply the initial equity of the project and in some cases keep a fraction right to the end of the PPP contract. The whole idea is to create long-term incentives which can prove costly for a sponsor in two aspects. Firstly, the cost of capital for the sponsor is high. Secondly, resources are blocked for a long time, which prevents them from being deployed in other areas. While the entire order secures the building and initial phase of the project, future business is limited. For a sponsor to be able to compensate on the initial fund spent, the project has to be hugely profitable. Although the SPV remains active for the entire life cycle of a project, the difference between financing during the construction phase and financing phase later on are clearly laid out. During construction, however, the sponsor's equity is often combined with government grants and bank loans. For projects that derive revenues from user fees, the initial contribution to investment can be supplemented with subsidies from the government. Once the completion of the construction stage approaches, all holders come into the picture as a substitute for bank lending. The bond financing is in turn associated with rating agencies and insurance companies. Only once the PPP project comes completely operational can the sponsor's equity be bought by a facility operator or investor. The entire life cycle of PPP finances depend on different incentive problems that are faced during the construction and operational phases. Needless to point out, construction is subject to uncertainties that fail under the categories of design changes and costs, for example. The risk factor lies precisely at this stage of the project. The process of the development and implementation of a public-private partnership project begins with the identification of a priority public investment project. Projects that they have the potential of becoming PPP projects emerge from a broader public investment planning and a project selection process. So that is it for today. If you wish to get more of this type of content, subscribe and hit the bell to receive notifications every time a new episode comes out. Thank you for listening and have a great and productive day.